So I'm here with Frannie Block. You're from the Free Press. You recently wrote an article on persecution, Christian persecution in China called China versus God, Ezra and Beijing's War on Christianity. We're going to talk about it. I want to just say before we even get into it, like, as I was reading it, I was in bed with my wife and we were just right before bed, we were just reading and talking about things. And I was reading through and I was like, it's a little chilling to read through because it's sort of like these dystopian novels that you read, like 1984 and things like that, or Fahrenheit 451 is another one where there's just this obsession from the state to shut down anything that opposes the state. And we talk about it in the United States, and that language is thrown around. Authoritarianism and totalitarianism is thrown around in the United States a lot, especially between political parties and against each other. But I don't think we haven't really experienced it in the United States at the level that they experienced it in China. So it was just a little chilling to read. That said, like, first off, thanks for coming on the podcast. Second, what is this story? Why'd you write it?
So this story really centers around a man named Ezra. He's a pastor in China. He's actually born and raised in a very small rural village in China. He experienced the Tiananmen Square massacre when he was a student at Beijing University in 1989. And it was that experience that actually drew him to Christianity. He said in the wake of the massacre, he was walking around the hallways of his campus and seeing kids who felt like they had no purpose, no direction in life, and feeling that emptiness, he ended up finding God. And through that, he ends up pursuing a career as a pastor. He starts working in a state-controlled church in China, which is a thing. The Chinese government has state-controlled churches where basically the sermons, the teachings, the hymns that you can sing, they're all essentially approved by an oversight body run by the Communist Party. But eventually he began to feel like that working within the confines of that church was not allowing him to actually pursue his mission of being a pastor and speaking directly to God and speaking with his congregants about God's teachings directly, because there was this layer of the Chinese Communist Party trying to interfere. Right. So through that, he eventually starts his own church, which in China, in some senses, was very legally risky for him to do. There were many other people around this time who also started to do this, and they're now known as underground churches. And that was a really long introduction into Ezra's story a bit, to say that in last October, Ezra was arrested along with around 36 other congregants, pastors, members of the church in one of the largest crackdowns on Christianity in a long time, in about a decade. And really what Ezra's story represents, and the reason I was so drawn to it, is one, I think it really showcases the untold story of the persecution that Christians in China have faced for many, many years. But the second is that I think that his story and what he's going through now, he's currently in prison facing kind of these propped up charges of illegally disseminating information online, which was a law that many people, say was basically created to imprison people like him. I think his story and what many Christians are now going through, especially those in prison, represents a further totalitarian turn for the Chinese regime that, for many years, I think could be considered authoritarian, that the Communist Party was the single party ruling over its people. There was no democracy in China, no freedom of speech, no freedom of expression, no freedom of religion. But this is an even bigger step. This is the step towards totalitarianism. As one person quoted in the story, Ezra's son-in-law says, it's China's turn towards trying to engineer the souls of its people, not just their lives.
So this is interesting because you mentioned Tiananmen Square. My wife was in China a couple of years back for kind of like a missions trip thing, but it wasn't really. It was sort of just like a bunch of Christians visiting China. Anyways, she was talking to students and things like that, and they discussed with all different people there. They didn't know, like a lot of young people didn't know what Tiananmen Square was or what even happened. And I actually think a lot of young Americans don't know what Tiananmen Square is. So first off, what happened during Tiananmen Square? What is that? And second, like how much is what happened there in the sort of social imaginary of the Chinese people? Like, do they know what happened?
So information in China is very tightly controlled, particularly information that reflects poorly on the Chinese government. And Tiananmen Square is by far and away among the most sensitive issues for the Chinese government. So back to 1989, this was a period in China, the 80s, where China was opening up to the world. Before that, it was actually very insular. Many of its economic policies, led by Mao Zedong, who took over China after winning in a civil war. He implemented many communist policies kind of based off of the Soviet model in the United States, or the Soviet model in the USSR. And he turned the country insular. In the 80s, looking for foreign direct investment, the new leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, he opened the country up to foreigners. Many foreigners started visiting China, started investing in China, working in China. And this really opened up the Chinese people to the world. And many young people, especially college students at this time, they started discovering, different ideas. Not just, I had a line in the piece, people were discovering Kentucky Fried Chicken, but they were also reading political philosophy and thinking of ideas of democracy. And this kind of inspired a movement across the country in China, led primarily by young people and many workers as well, who were asking for democracy, more transparency in government. And the kind of epicenter of this was Beijing University in Beijing. And that's where Ezra Jin was a student in 1989. So over the course of many months, students were flocking to Tiananmen Square, which is this huge, it's hard to describe how massive it is, but it's this massive square in the middle of Beijing, right next to the Forbidden City, which is one of the ancient kind of cities that's within Beijing. And students started flocking and protesting, saying, we want democracy, we want transparency in our government, here's what we want, and they demanded meetings with China's leaders. And this was happening in campuses all over the country, but definitely the biggest movement was in Beijing. And eventually the Chinese government faced a choice. They could either talk with these protesters, hear their demands, and try to implement some of their changes, or they could go for a bloody crackdown. And they chose the latter. And so on June 4th, 1989, the Chinese government decided to send tanks into Tiananmen Square. And what followed was a hugely bloody massacre of many of these protesters. And in the aftermath of that, many of the leaders of the Tiananmen Square movement, again, a peaceful movement, protest movement, were hunted down by the government, arrested, disappeared. And so this was really a turning point for many people in China. Obviously, you can understand why the Chinese government finds it to be sensitive, that they don't want to bring it up. But this was really the first sign of totalitarianism in China, that the Chinese government was not going to tolerate any form of dissent, no matter what it looked like. And estimates of how many people were killed during that massacre range from a couple hundred to a couple thousand. And so part of that is that the Chinese government didn't really allow for an investigation to understand the true impact of it.
This is interesting because next week, I told you before we're recording, but I'm going to interview a guy who's a professor in Hong Kong, wrote a history of China. And as I'm reading it, you start to get the understanding that, and I've gotten this understanding over the past couple of months as I've looked into what actually happened in the 1900s in the world, because something weird happened in the 18 and 1900s with the Industrial Revolution, and then the two world wars, and everything just got weird in the last 200 years. And you see how China was impacted by globalization, or just the opening up of the world. And there's videos in the 70s of Nixon and Mao, he went to China. He was the first president to go to China and meet with Mao.
It's a very big deal.
Yeah. He was having sushi with him or something. I don't know what he was eating. I don't know if sushi's even Chinese, but he was doing something with them. And there was just videos of him, and it was interesting. But you see the influence of, I think that, so I'm not justifying Tiananmen Square or anything like that. But when you think of it from the perspective of the Chinese, they're okay, we've kind of done something one sort of way for a very, 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 very long time, thousands of years. And they've had dynasties and sort of emperor rule or authoritarian rule to some capacity. And then the Western ideas start to break in. And with that, some economic, breakthroughs and things like that. And then people start to rise up and have a voice. This is the first time in Chinese history, in the history of the entire East, that anybody probably even had the idea like, hey, we could maybe overturn the government or something like that. So
actually not quite.
No,
I will
okay.
say, I mean, there are many movements throughout Chinese history of people demanding democracy. In the early 1910s, it was actually a lot of artists and writers. And there was a huge crackdown then. At that time, actually, the nationalist government was in charge in China, which eventually then went to civil war with the Communist Party, which was led by Mao. So Mao didn't come to power until 1949. So modern China, as we know it and see it today, really started in 1949 when Mao Zedong and the Communist Party won that civil war over the nationalist government, which fled to Taiwan. So China does have a really long history, but it actually isn't a communist history. It's a deeply philosophical history. You have people like Lao Tzu, you have philosophers like Confucius who really influenced the structure and hierarchy of Chinese society during the dynasties. And then during the early 1900s, you see kind of these emerging visions of what China is. And eventually Mao Zedong wins out and takes control in 1949.
That's interesting. No, that's good. That's good. Good correction there. So basically Tiananmen Square happens. And so kind of go into the story a little bit. So he wants to become a pastor. He starts a church. And then when do the problems start to arise with the Chinese government?
So throughout time, one thing that's important to understand about how the Chinese government exerts its control over people is that there are periods of tightening and loosening. And so at first, again, Pastor Jin, he is working with the state-sanctioned churches. And so within those churches, they're state-sanctioned, even though he's not fully happy with the way that he feels that these churches are glorifying God. He doesn't feel like they fully are glorifying God because of the Chinese Communist Party's control. So eventually, when he begins to start his own church in 2008, this is actually more of an opening up period. This is a slight easing of restrictions in China. He begins to start a community that flourishes. It has hundreds of members in Beijing, and things are going pretty well. They have actually a space that they rent out in downtown Beijing where people can come and congregate together and attend services together. So things within his church, which is called Zion Church, are going pretty well at this time. But then obviously there's moments of restricting where the government comes in, police officers knock on the door, start asking questions, start, mildly intimidating people. But the real crackdown, what we can call the watershed moment, is in 2018. And that was the first real wave of persecution of members of Zion Church and some other churches in China that is notable for Pastor Jin's story. So around that time, the police officers knocked on the door of Zion Church and told Pastor Jin that he needed to install facial recognition cameras inside of the sanctuary. When he refused to do so, they shut down the physical space of the church. And after that, Pastor Jin, he's an extremely creative guy. He decided to take his sermons online. So he started recording them and releasing them so that people could listen to them either by themselves. They could listen to them in headphones in when they're going on a hike or going to the grocery store. They could gather and congregate in small groups so that people could listen together without, rising suspicion of the authorities in China. So he starts to find these ways to circumnavigate while also saving the church. What he couldn't have expected was the COVID-19 lockdown. So in 2020, he's already online. His church is already essentially well prepared to meet the moment for when so many people are isolated and stuck inside and unable to congregate together. And during that time, his daughter, who's in the United States and who I interviewed for this story, she told me the church just flourished during that time because so many different people were able to access the church's sermons. It went from a church just focused in Beijing to across China and even across the world for Chinese speakers. So that 2018 is the first crackdown. Pastor Jin pivots and finds a way to keep the church alive, to keep it thriving. But then we come to 2025, and that is when the government passed another law that Pastor Jin's family perceived to be likely directing the church regarding dissemination of information online. And his family members actually start recording interviews with him because they suspect that a crackdown could be coming and they wanted to preserve his story. And then just a month later in October, 2025, he and around 36 others are arrested in these middle of the night raids all across the country. The way Bill, Ezra's son-in-law, describes it is it was literally like as if they were going after a drug syndicate. That is kind of the level of police force that came after these church leaders and church members in October.
So what's the reasoning behind the fluctuating tolerance for Christianity in China? So it's like you said, in 2008, things opened up and then they kind of closed back up 10 years later in 2018. Do we know why that happened?
So it's interesting. It doesn't just apply to Christianity. I think it applies to any gray area when it comes to living within China and operating in a community or a group where you know that the Chinese government is likely looking at you and watching you. There's this amazing China scholar. His name is Perry Link. And I always reference this article he wrote called The Anaconda and the Chandelier. And the idea of the anaconda and the chandelier is essentially that sometimes it tightens, sometimes it loosens. It's always slithering about. And the idea is that if you never know when it's going to tighten, then you will kind of choose to self-censor. You might choose not to attend the church because you don't know the risks. And that unknown is essentially a powerful tool for an authoritarian regime to be able to control people's lives because they'll never know whether or not something that's in a gray area is over the line because that line, it's always shifting.
That's interesting. And I think that, some people might be confused as to like, okay, so some of these churches can sort of have a public service, but they're sort of under the control of the Chinese government to some capacity. And so then others can't. And so this podcast started as a theology podcast like 6 years ago. So the point of, one of the main realities in Christianity is just that your first, submission is to God and then it's to the government after that. And so when a pastor starts to preach sort of out of fear of the government, usually submission to God goes out the window because now you're in submission to a human authority. So is that sort of the deal? Like, are there a lot of these churches there that are just going to do what the government tells them to do? Or are there a lot of those churches?
Yeah, so there are the state-sanctioned churches. They're still operating. And Pastor Jin is very, careful about this because he knows that there are wonderful people who attend those churches and are doing the best that they can to be able to practice their, religion and show their belief and faith in God in the best way that they can. But because of the constraints placed on those churches that you just so artfully explained, many people do choose to go to these underground churches. And that's really why they started to pop up, as people were looking for that direct connection to God, not one that was funneled through the Communist Party, that was allowed by the Communist Party. And this is really a central theme of this piece. And another reason why I wanted to pursue it for the Free Press is that in a totalitarian regime like China arguably is today, if there is a power higher than the Communist Party, that inherently threatens the entire foundation of the totalitarian regime. And so that is the Chinese government's chief concern is making sure that people's allegiance is always to the party first before anything else. And obviously that does stand in contrast to people's religious beliefs in many ways. People who say, no, I don't submit first to the party. I submit first to God.
Why are the Chinese people so susceptible to this? So I think this is sort of like what's confusing about the history of China is because I think, you're obviously right. Like in the 1900s, things changed across the whole world. And so it sounds like there were multiple, democratic sort of intrusions into the Chinese world. But like, what is it that has made the Chinese people so susceptible to governmental control in a way that other countries across the world aren't, that might not have Christian heritage? So China doesn't have Christian heritage, obviously. But like, what is it about them? Because Russia is, at least, they say that they're Christian. They're like Russian Orthodox and things like that. And they're part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so there's some adherence to Christianity or some adherence to God from Putin even. But Xi Jinping and the Chinese people seem to be uniquely separated even from Russia and other countries, and that the people are just incredibly susceptible to this. So what is that?
Well, I think you can't even begin to answer that question without understanding the Chinese economy over the past 50 years. So when Mao Zedong took power in 1949, China was a very poor country. And during Mao's tenure as well, the Chinese people endured a horrible famine, one of the worst man-made famines in human history. They endured political chaos and societal chaos. But then shortly after that, when Deng Xiaoping comes to power, the Chinese economy goes on a boom that is kind of unprecedented in modern economic history. And nowhere else in the world were people improving in terms of their socioeconomic status year by year than they were in China, generation by generation. You have generations alive who survived the greatest man-made famine in human history, who are also founding some of the largest multi-billion-dollar companies in the world. It's kind of an unfathomable economic jump. And so the stability of the Chinese Communist Party, I think, is directly tied to the strength of the Chinese economy. It's why many observers now are questioning that strength. China is actually having today some internal economic struggles that many people say could point to signs of the Communist Party losing control.
What are those struggles? Tell me
so
about
China's
that.
facing a massive housing crisis right now.
Really?
In addition to that, they have a massive debt crisis. Many local provinces have taken on massive infrastructure projects that they just can't simply even begin to pay back and are at risk of going into default because of that. So that's obviously a huge problem for the economy. And on top of that, they also have a population crisis as a result of the one-child policy. Right now, they just have not enough young people to power the economy for how many older people that need to be supported by it. So those are just a couple of the economic problems that China is facing today. And many observers point to those problems and say, these are weakness points for the Communist Party. Like, if they don't have the economy, they don't have any case to make to their people of why they do restrict their freedoms in other ways. But on the counter, many people look at, times when the Chinese economy has faced some incredible strife, like during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it somehow survived through that as well, and has somehow tightened its control over the population in the process. So depending on who you ask, they might have different perceptions of the strength of the Chinese Communist Party's control over the people today, right now.
So that's really interesting, because my understanding, I guess what I've been hearing is that there is a shifting in global superpower. Like, who's the dominating world superpower? Apparently that's a big question right now. Was the United States for the longest time? China seems to have some more sway in geopolitics. They seem to have, obviously, economics. We owe them quite a bit in the United States. Everything that we have is made in China, unfortunately. And so from your perspective, like, what is happening on the geopolitical landscape? And I'm sure this ties into the story somehow, but I just think this is interesting. Like, what is happening in the geopolitical landscape with China? Are they now an emerging world superpower, or is that just blown up out of proportion to make Westerners scared?
I mean, personally, I think China's not an emerging superpower. I think it has emerged. And I think, you just look at the Chinese military's capabilities and the way in which they've grown over the past few decades as just one data point to understand really how China has emerged. In addition, you look at China's influence in major international organizations like the United Nations. Just seeing the way, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, that the Chinese government was able to really control how the World Health Organization operated and the information it put out, I think is one big example of China's rise. The third, I would say, is if you look at developing countries where China has made huge investments, particularly in countries where the United States has pulled back on its investments, whether it's in health programs or infrastructure or whatever you call it. But for the last many years, the Chinese government had a World Economic Program called the One Belt, One Road Initiative, where they were investing heavily in infrastructure projects in Africa, in Latin America. And the idea behind it is that to gain favor with the people there, establishing media programs, media literacy programs, establishing news organizations as we've just seen in the United States, the mayor of Arcadia near Los Angeles was just indicted for running a Chinese news site at the direction of ministers who are associated with the party. Like, so in that sense, I think China has emerged and it very much is in competition with the United States for the status of the global superpower. That doesn't negate the fact that China can still be struggling internally with certain economic issues, social issues, political issues. The United States struggles with issues as well. I think the question that observers who look at China need to ask is whether or not, because China is this authoritarian, totalitarian regime, whether or not they are able to kind of maintain control over the population and have the population have enough faith in them, them being the party, that they will, that they can continue to lead uncontested. That's when you look internally at China, what I think a lot of observers are looking at, but externally, China definitely, it's emerged, it's here, and it's in competition with the United States, I think, on multiple fronts.
So what do you think the future is going to be like? Because I have my opinions about the United States. I'm not incredibly happy with, like, the West was growing up. I guess I heard, my great grandfather was in World War II. And so you hear stories of like the great, generations of the United States, probably the great generation being the last one. I'm not a big fan of the boomers or the millennials or my own generation. So whatever, but like things have seen.
Gen Z's okay. We're working on it.
They're nihilistic at their core. I mean, and they're nihilistic. They're not as bad as millennials. Like millennials are bad. Anyways, that's a whole, we could talk about that. But the thing is, like, we're declining as a civilization. I think that's a fact. I think that when you murder close to 100 million babies in 60 years, you're committing civilizational suicide, which we have. And other countries across the world are doing the same thing. All over Europe, that's happening. And then you have the immigration problems in Europe with basically Islam taking over some of the most beautiful places in Europe with some of the richest Western history. And it's just a very sad thing. The question, I guess, that I have for you is, one, do you agree with everything that I just said, or do you disagree with that? But two, with China being an emerged world superpower, like, does their influence just continue to grow and ours shrink, or what happens over the next several decades?
Well, let me start with your first point of your perception of the world. I would characterize you perhaps as a bit of a doomer. 100%. You can tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I'm a bit more of an optimist. I think that particularly in the United States, we have never lived in a more prosperous time. I think that there is so much opportunity for people. And obviously, people have debates. Is the American dream dead? Is it still accessible? Worthy debates to have. Life is expensive. All these, things that we need to navigate as a society. How do we navigate AI? But I do think that we're living on the cusp of so much opportunity and so much prosperity in this country. And so I prove to be an optimist on that.
Can I just say, I don't think I'm a doomer. I think when you read history, like you look at Rome, you look at the fall of Rome, you look at the fall of Carthage and some of the greatest civilizations in human history, they started to fall when they started to murder babies and sacrifice babies. And this is a thing that people don't want to talk about. They don't talk about the abortion problem in the United States, but 60 million is the official number. It's more than that with IVF and other things too. We can debate the ethical whatever of those things, but let's just say I'm like a pretty hardcore Christian conservative guy. So like, I think those things are murder, but like we're killing our babies. Like we have a death rate higher than the birth rate. So regardless of what economic prosperity we have, and there can be a debate on like, okay, what is that based on? It's based on sort of the promise of the United States military, because we took ourselves off the gold standard in the 70s, which means that we have no sort of finite base for our financial system. Like, and I think the economy is going towards more of a, what would you call it? It's not a meritocracy anymore, but a lot of it is built off of sort of personal relationships. And like you look at Trump and like his kids and the way that the political parties are run now, and it's sort of elitist families that are like allowing for their families to continue to run things and things like that. And I think that that's trickled down into like every aspect. I mean, at least where I live, if your parent is involved in something, you can probably get a job there. And that means it's incredibly difficult for people, for the American dream to prosper, because you can't come from overseas if you don't have connections and get a job or do something, especially as like a white person, because there's already DI things in places to disparage you. And that's more true in some places than other places. Like I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. We're like progressive, like really hardcore. So, being a white Christian guy is not the best thing in the world. I still have a good life and I'm happy with where I'm at. So I'm not complaining, but all that to say, like, I don't think that that's a doomer attitude, and maybe it sounds like it, but I think that that's just the reality of where we're at as a country. And I just don't know, like, how can things be looking up? I'm not trying to be rude or anything, but like, how can things be looking up?
I hear you, but
way?
I mean, you also have, like, all politics aside, J.D. Vance, the vice president of the United States. I don't know if you've read his book, but how he grew up in the community he grew up in, to where he is today as the vice president of the United States, and all that he endured along the way. That is a quintessentially American story, and it is really inspiring. And I think, obviously, what you mentioned, the fact that personal relationships do get you, far, they can open up doors for you. That's absolutely true. But I think that that's always been true in America. Like, I don't think now is particularly worse in terms of that disparity for people who have those connections versus those who don't than in any other time in history in the United States. So I don't necessarily see that as being particularly extreme today. And I think that, we're living in an age where you can open up an AI chatbot and code a company and sell that company and like use that to build a life on. Like, people are doing that now. And I don't know. That's my optimistic self, but I hear what you're saying as well.
No, I can totally see that. I mean, there's a lot to talk about with AI. I do think like Vance is actually an interesting person because his political philosophy is highly influenced by Patrick Deneen. I don't know if you know who Patrick Deneen is. He's a political philosopher from Notre Dame. He wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed back in like 2018 or something. Super famous. Like, Obama read it and was like, this is great, even though critiqued Obama. So good for Obama for taking the critique. But like, J.D. Vance is influenced by him a lot, by Patrick Deneen. Patrick Deneen's whole worldview is creating a post-liberal world. It's called the post-liberals. And so there is something shifting in that in the younger generations, away from, people are frustrated with sort of liberal democratic democracy, for good or bad. I don't actually like that a lot of young people, you see like the rise of Nick Fuentes and people kind of, and even on the religious side of things, Doug Wilson and the Christian nationalists who want like a American Prince, which that whole book is idiotic and doesn't make any sense actually it doesn't even work biblically. But anyways, there is a shift, and you're seeing it with these younger generations who are frustrated with what's happened over the past 100 years with globalization, with shipping out manufacturing all over the world, especially to China, strengthening our enemies, and then going to wars all the time. And, all this stuff, which some of it seems like talking points and some of it is like, is Nick Fuentes, like, how is he even famous and stuff like that? How is Candace Owens famous? But these are things that I talk to regular people all the time, and they're just frustrated with the way that things are. And so they're sort of like, the only way to describe it, I guess you probably understand this too. The Old Testament in Exodus, the Jews leave Israel. They leave Egypt. They're given freedom. And then while they're in the desert, they're like, we want a king. They then desire a king later on. So they almost want the tyranny back that they had left. And that seems like the story arc of the United States. We left the tyranny of England. We gained our freedom. For some reason, we became incredibly immoral, and then we blame the freedom for the immorality that we have personally. And now we're desiring a king. It seems like that's what young people want. I don't like it. I think that's really dangerous. And I like democracy, but the morality of things I think needs to be discussed, because even if we're economically prosperous, it doesn't mean that we're morally prosperous. And sometimes like those two things are working at odds. Not to just like derail the conversation. Sorry, but I'm just,
well, this is a totally interesting conversation. But remind me of your second question that you. had asked about China.
About China. Yeah. The China question. The first one is basically like, is the worldview that I'm setting forth make any sense? I think the second one was something about like, what do you see happening over the next decade with America and China, their relationship with each other? Who's the superpower? Like, who is the one top world empire? Yeah. Good luck with this.
I don't want to play the predictor. I have no idea.
Sure.
And anything I say is pure speculation. Obviously, maybe I'll answer this question through like fears that I have. Obviously, military conflict over Taiwan.
Yeah.
If China invades Taiwan and how that plays out and what's going to happen there. And will the United States come to Taiwan's defense? What does that look like? How will that impact domestic politics in the United States? That's a question we need to grapple with. There's a wonderful scholar at the Hoover Institute at Stanford named Ike Friedman, who just wrote a book about this. It just came out. It's called Defending Taiwan. And he kind of lays out a strategy for how to avoid this conflict and, keep strategic power in place where this doesn't happen. But that I think is one of the biggest questions we're facing in the future. The second with China, I think does have to do with artificial intelligence, compute power. Obviously, in the United States, there is big debate over whether or not some of these large chip companies should be able to sell state-of-the-art chip technology to China.
Yeah.
I probably lean more on the side of no, they should not.
I totally agree with you. I think
that is, American ingenuity, and it should stay in America.
It's a security issue. These are like military. This is like military weaponry. Yeah,
massive security issues. There's also security issues regarding research partnerships with Chinese universities, where like we've got dozens, if not more, research partnerships between these top American universities and these top Chinese universities that are associated with the Chinese military that are working on issues like aerodynamics and like submarines and things that could have direct military applications. I think those are things to look at in the future on the security front. But I think with AI and chips, you have technologies coming out like the latest Anthropic model that was just released, where they literally said we cannot release this to the public because it is so powerful. How are we going to navigate that as a world when these technologies become that powerful? I think those are the two big questions about China. So I slightly evaded your question,
I know,
but hopefully that was still an interesting answer.
Well, you can't. I mean, you don't know what's going to happen in 10 years, but I do think it connects directly to your story, because I think Americans forget, or they just become lackadaisical because we live between two oceans and we have Canada. They're not going to do anything. We have Mexico beneath us. They're not going to do anything. So we always think we're sort of invincible, but over the last 150 years, the world has become smaller and influence has become easier. You look at TikTok, you look at what like China has become influential across the world and in places that you didn't think they could become influential, and in the United States and in very obvious ways. And like, if this is what they're doing in their own country to people who want to honestly and sincerely worship God, then if they continue to grow, if they continue to take over, world economies and make things happen, like we talked about earlier before we were recording, what happened in Iran with the negotiations and China coming in and kind of telling Iran what to do. And you're like, what in the world is that? Like, China now has sway on major geopolitical things happening. And so we like to think we're invincible in the United States, but I just don't think that that's the case. And I think that we need to keep an eye on China. And obviously you think that because you are keeping an eye on China. So all that I think that connects to it, because it's an authoritarian sort of government. They want to shut people down who don't worship the way that they want them to worship, which is worshiping themselves. And so it's just a dangerous thing. And for Americans, we can just become easily blind. Would you agree with that assessment, or do you think that that's important?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you raise is actually back to my optimistic perception of the United States. So I'll try to make
America. I'll just say I love America. I think it's a great country.
Okay, good. Yeah. But I'll try to make this case, which is that, in writing and reporting on this story about what Christians in China are going through to to do the simple act of practicing their faith, finding themselves, in some cases, being interrogated by police. It's so common among Christians. They call it being taken out for tea.
Yeah.
So being taken out for tea by police in China simply for being a member of a church. In some cases, people have been intimidated away from joining the church, kind of being slightly threatened by police. There have been documented cases of people's kids being ousted from different schools because they were members of churches, or cases where people's bank accounts were actually tampered with because they were members of churches. So all of these levels of intimidation simply just to practice your faith. Think back to the United States of America with all of our qualms, with everything that we're handling. You know, it is so easy to take for granted the freedoms that we have in this country to practice our faith, to exercise our faith, to exercise freedom of speech, to, you know, be our own individuals, to say whatever we want about the government, you know, whether or not you like Donald Trump, whether or not you like JD Vance, whoever, like you as an American have the right to say whatever you want. And that is a luxury, or I shouldn't say a luxury. I mean, it is an inalienable right, but you know, it is not something that is granted to people around the world. And it is something that I think many times we can lose sight of and not have the gratitude for it that it deserves, because it is truly an amazing right that we do have here. So that's my rant about America.
Yeah.
But beyond that, your point also made me think about China's influence broadly and how it can seep into America. And that is something that's also worth looking into. And I document in this story how Ezra's family, his daughter, Grace, is a U.S. citizen now, married to a U.S. citizen. His wife, Anna, lives in the United States, and they have documented cases of facing transnational repression. That the Chinese government, they said, has tried to hack them, that they've seen strange cars lingering outside of their home. Ezra's wife, in the United States, in Washington, D.C., in Illinois. Ezra's wife, Anna, says that she mysteriously found that her tires had been slashed one day. You know, they constantly feel like they're being monitored. I've spoken with other individuals who've spoken out against the Chinese government for multiple reasons. Many activists from Hong Kong, for example, who've talked about being followed home from protests and being stalked, essentially, because they're speaking out in the United States about the Chinese government. This happens in the United Kingdom as well. And so I think that the idea that the Chinese government can intimidate people, U.S. citizens on U.S. soil, that is a serious national security problem that, you know, I don't know if our government is fully equipped to be able to protect people as much as they should be. And people like Grace and Bill, you know, Ezra's children who are advocating for his release are now putting themselves at risk, even though they're here in the United States.
All right. Is the government doing anything about it? Is the United States government doing anything about that? Because I think as I was reading, I think I picked up on the fact that they're in the United States is kind of crazy. Like they can intimidate from the United States. Are we doing anything?
So I actually spoke to Senator Ted Cruz about this, and I asked him this directly because he's been speaking up a lot on Pastor Ezra Jin and many others who are imprisoned in China, including Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. And he said, you know, the government's doing everything they can. Obviously, the FBI gets involved in cases like these and prosecutes if there's an ability to prosecute. But, you know, ultimately, it's not easy. Easier said than done. And I think the case of the mayor of Arcadia is a great example of how easy it is right now for the Chinese government to infiltrate different facets of American life. And there aren't quite fully the safeguards in place for how to manage that and deal with that. So I won't pretend to have all the insights into the intelligence that the United States has on what goes on here. But, you know, as of right now, there are these documented cases of intimidation against Christians, against Hong Kong activists, against Tibetans, against Uyghurs. All of these different groups, activists from each of them have documented cases of transnational repression that they have felt in the United States.
Okay, so as I was reading through the article, it kept popping into my head, and maybe I'm just crazy, but it kept popping into my head that it some ways felt a lot like, I remember during COVID on social media, like if you said the wrong thing or if you did the wrong thing, you get deplatformed. Some people did get debanked, like their banking shut off and things like that. So as you're writing this sort of stuff, or as you're looking into China and the authoritarianism there, did you see parallels to what was happening 5-6 years ago in the United States? And like, how close were we to that? Like, what was that in 2020 with COVID?
So obviously there were documented cases of the government overstepping and infringing on people's freedom of speech. And again, what's great about the United States is that people were able to push back against that and get really substantive wins in court, where the government had to admit that their wrongdoing and provide some sort of remedy. Now, that doesn't make it okay that the government did that. It surely doesn't make it, seem in line with the Constitution that they would restrict people's speech in that way and try to silence them because they disagreed with their beliefs. But the fact that we have a court system that allowed people to seek that remedy and be able to show the government that they had done something wrong and push back, I think is an example of the fact that the institutions of our democracy are still functioning, still doing what they need to do. As people we'll freak out that the institutions are falling, but in many cases, they are still operating as they should be. And I do think that that's a good example of that. Yeah, no, I completely agree. It was a little weird back then. I just remember I was on a political campaign, and the guy that was running was one of the kind of famous doctors who was like, "Hey, hold on, what's going on here?" And we couldn't get we were trying to do Facebook ads, and it was just, no one was able to see anything that we were putting out there, which seems pathetic compared to what they're dealing with in China. So I understand that, but there was a little bit of that happening, and there's always a danger of that. But I think you're right. The institutions are durable. They've lasted this long. It doesn't mean that they're going to last forever, but they're still in place, and they do their job in the United States. So Trump met with Xi Jinping was it in the last week or something? So what happened last week? So a lot of the summit was focused on trade. So President Trump actually traveled there with many different tech and AI leaders, which it raised a lot of eyebrows, actually, including Jensen Huang, who's the head of NVIDIA. And I already talked to you about AI and chips, and Jensen Huang has pushed for NVIDIA to be able to sell those chips. So that raised a lot of eyebrows. To sell to China. Yeah. So that was a big part of the meeting, I believe, was trade, tariffs. Obviously, the United States has imposed strict tariffs on China under Trump, and so navigating that. I don't really think that they addressed Taiwan. Trump sent out a tweet or a Truth Social post about Taiwan that was kind of confusing to people about where they stood. So I think it really was more an economic meeting than anything. But there was actually a substantive, significant development in the story of Ezra Jin, which is that Donald Trump actually said he raised Pastor Jin's story directly with Xi Jinping, and that Xi Jinping said he was seriously considering releasing him. So, I mean, to me, that's what I was watching for the summit is what's going to happen with Ezra's case, in the case of the other pastors who are still sitting in prison since October. And so that was a significant development. We haven't heard anything since. So now we just, hope and wait for news that potentially Pastor Jin may be able to see his family again, and the other pastors may be able to come home and see their families. So what is that? What would that mean? If he says, all right, we're going to release him, we're going to what would that mean for freedom of religion in China, or whatever we want to call that? And what would that mean about the United States influence on China? Because if Trump can go in there and have a conversation, I mean, that seems to be a big deal. Yeah, I think it is a big deal. I think if Donald Trump somehow finds a way for prisoners of conscience to be released by a regime that does not like doing that, it would be a massive win and a huge testament to the fact that he still holds sway over Xi Jinping. There are some people who say that Xi entered that summit on the upper hand, and some who would argue Trump entered that summit with the upper hand. And so this I think would be a very big sign of Trump's influence over Xi and power over Xi. In terms of what that practically means for Pastor Jin and the other Christians in prison now, I don't know. I don't know if that means that they're released to China. I don't know if that means that they flee to the United States or elsewhere seeking asylum. I have no idea what that means if they were to be released. But at the very least, I know that his family is just praying for his freedom. And in the meantime, praying that, he continues to have the strength to endure what he's facing in prison now.
As far as persecution goes, globally, I don't know if you've looked into this at all. I haven't, but have you seen, I guess, over the past decade or so, persecution of Christians go on the rise, or is it on the decline? Because I know that there's a period of time in the United States where there's a lot of intellectual persecution. I'm using air quotes because it's like intellectual or whatever. But like there was, the new atheists kind of just shut down Christianity, and they were like, evolution and all of that is true, and Darwin is our God, and we have to worship him. And Christians didn't like that. But there's been a rise in Christian church attendance in the United States, I think among Gen Z as well. So like Christianity is kind of on the rise in America, I'll just say. And has that affected the impact that America has had on sort of global persecution on the church? Or have you looked into that?
The short answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
I will say that the Trump administration has really made this essential part of the administration in ways that I think many people found surprising. And so obviously the case of Pastor Jin, the fact that Trump raised that with she directly, I think was a big sign of how important this is to the Trump administration. But additionally, the Trump administration has spoken out very forcefully about the persecution of Christians in Nigeria and elsewhere around the world. So I do think that the administration is taking this issue very seriously, the issue being persecution of Christians around the world and the United States' role in trying to protect them. So I think that we may see further developments from the United States on that, but these are issues that at times get mainstream coverage and then kind of, I feel like they dissipate and they're not always true in the news. And so that's why being in a place like the Free Press, we can cover those issues that aren't always being picked up and focused on by the mainstream media.
It feels like you guys are the only ones that do. I mean, I don't read everybody, but I feel like when I look at the Free Press, and one of the things I admire about the Free Press, not to just like talk you guys up or anything like that, but you guys talk about persecution, and that is something that's like happening all over the world. The Nigeria story, where there were like thousands of Christians being killed in Nigeria, I think, and I didn't see that anywhere until that story came out in the Free Press, and then it sort of got more recognition. Is that like an internal decision at the Free Press? You guys are like, we're going to do this. We're going to talk about persecution happening against Christians, or is that just something that's popped up and different reporters have taken that on?
I think individual reporters have taken these stories on because they see the importance of them and the significance of them. But I think the fact that reporters at the Free Press have taken these stories on is emblematic of like the broader ethos of the company, which is the types of stories that we pursue, being stories about, we're the Free Press. This is a company that believes very strongly in the American project, in the inalienable rights that we as Americans all have. And when those rights are at risk, when those rights are being infringed upon, those are the stories where Free Press journalists run to cover. And so I do think that ethos has inspired many of us individually to pursue these stories. So obviously I did this story about Pastor Jin in China, but my colleagues, Josh Code, Maddie Kearns, they've covered what's going on in Nigeria very carefully. And I think that unfortunately, as the persecution of Christians continues to be a problem in many of these countries around the world, we will continue to cover these issues. And I will definitely be continuing to cover every development in Pastor Jin's case.
Good. Can I ask you one more question that's just completely outside of the realm of...
Go for it.
Okay. You're in media, and this is something like I'm trying to follow media. Things have changed over the past 5 or 6 years. We were talking about it beforehand, but as things shift and change in media, there was legacy media when it first started, ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, those like the 4 main ones. And then you had cable news that came, CNN, Fox News. And then you had, the New York Times and these sort of things that have been around for a very long time, the newspaper, but then you had the internet news. So anyways, now you have these independent news institutions. I don't know what you would call the free press, but sort of these new media institutions that are like the free press, like the Daily Wire. And then you even go further into the next step, which is just like independent, like independent on steroids, like the Tucker Carlson network, like just the one person thing, or the Candace Owens, whatever she has, or Nick Fuentes, or, Alex Jones has InfoWars, but it's basically Alex Jones. And there's a lot of right-wing ones. I don't know if there's a bunch of left-wing ones. I mean, I think Don Lemon tried it. I don't know where he's at now because he's in trouble. But like, what are you seeing as far as influence goes? Like, how seriously, from your perspective and from the free press's perspective, like, are you taking people like Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, especially on the right, because they just seem to me more notable than any of the independent journalists on the left?
Great questions. How seriously are we taking them?
Yeah, like how seriously? Like, do you think that they actually have the influence that everybody thinks that they have? I guess that's the question that I'm asking, because some people will claim that it's all bots or Pakistanis or whatever, but what is it?
Well, I won't speak for the institution of the free press. I'll speak just for myself.
Sure.
I think like everything, it is, there are multiple truths. I think that the influence that many of these people, Nick Fuentes, Candace, Tucker, that they have is very real. It's big. I think they are tapping into, a population that feels cast aside by, the rest of the media landscape, the political landscape, and are looking for other leaders and influencers in that space. I also think with social media, kind of the rise of influencer journalism is obviously having a huge impact on the way people consume and interact with news, and the kind of outsized individual power that one person can have over shaping one person's narrative, I think is something important to look at and understand. I don't necessarily know if that's a good thing, because I think that it isolates people from understanding a broad range of perspectives. With that being said, I'll speak about the state of Florida, where I'm based. Right now we have running for governor on the Republican ticket, Byron Donalds, who's endorsed by Donald Trump. And then you've got a guy like James Fishback, who many people are kind of tying to Fishback to Fuentes, to the Kuiper movement in some way, shape, or form.
America First. I don't know if they would be part of that.
like more of that messaging. Obviously James Fishback has had a jump in the polls. With that being said, Byron Donalds is still clearing away the favorite to win that nomination. So while obviously I think that, looking at candidates who are coming from that media ecosystem that you just mentioned are gaining, some influence and some steam in elections at the end of the day, people still gravitate towards more traditional candidates in the same way that I think they also gravitate towards news, where I think that they know that they're getting an honest, fair shake.
Interesting.
And obviously you have the legacy institutions, which in many ways have lost people's trust. And I think that's why new institutions like the free press have been successful in gaining people's trust and showing them that, hey, like, we're going to do the real old school journalism that you're craving, that you feel like you're not getting at these legacy institutions anymore. But at the end of the day, like, the news media landscape is a battle for trust. And I think, I expressed my concerns about influencer journalism, and maybe that trust goes too far, where it's like, unbreakable. It's like, whatever this person says, I'm just going to agree with them. And I don't necessarily think that's good for the country.
I don't think that's good for the country either. I think it seems to be inevitable, though, because, and again, I'm like, you're optimistic. I'm not. Like, I just think it seems to be inevitable because of the philosophical stream in which we're swimming in the West, which is individualism to its final end, which is basically people just listen to whatever narrative they want, whether or not it's true. And I saw this today that Amazon is releasing, or they've released this thing, and I don't even know what you'd call this, but where their AI will create a podcast for you on the spot on whatever topic you want. So you can type in a topic.
That's really freaky.
I hate it. I'm not an AI guy anyways, because I think that it's inherently spiritual, because language is inherently spiritual. And when you build technological beings or whatever we want to call these things on the basis of language. They have an inherently spiritual aspect to them, which is like in the Bible, like Jesus is the logos, he's the word. And so I think AI is like a counterfeit logos. There's way more to that. That sounds like a crazy thing right out of the gate, but there's way more to that.
I think the Free Press did a debate about this, by the way.
Yeah, I got to watch that. I saw that. I got to watch that. I'm not an AI guy, but like that freaks me out because we're basically already doing that to some capacity. Like you can basically find the person that you want to listen to that'll say what you want, but now you can like fine tune that exactly to what you want with AI. And that seems like something where somebody should say, let's not do this. Like, here's a cool story, and then I'll shut up. If do you know, is it Weinstein, Brett Weinstein? Do you know him? Brett Weinstein. He's like a really famous, evolutionary biologist. He's like got super famous during COVID, like friends with Jordan Peterson. And he did a lecture with Jordan Peterson that my wife and I went to. And we got to go backstage to like talk with them, and it was a whole thing. But anyways, I asked him about AI. I remember asking him about AI. I was like, what do you think about AI? And he said to me, and this is really weird coming from an evolutionary biologist who believes in like progress and humans evolving into whatever's next. He was like, yeah, I think we all should have gotten together. All of the AI people should have gotten together, and we should have said, like, here's what's actually going to come of this. And we need to all pull the plugs on the AI. And that conversation like just made me feel weird because I was like, you're like, I don't agree with you philosophically. I don't agree with you historically on things. Like I'm a Christian, you're an evolutionary biologist. Our worldviews don't fully align, but we both see this thing exactly the same. And I think what he was alluding to is kind of the same thing. It's like this thing is like computing. It's like built on language. And he said the only differentiating factor between human beings and all other creatures is that we can speak systematized languages, which is obviously true. And so if you look like the Tower of Babel in the Bible, and it's like, what was the punishment for everybody who spoke the same language, who built the big tower? They disseminated with different languages. Like that was the punishment. You have to go and speak different languages. And so I don't know. That all just freaks me out. I don't remember even what this started with. Just the idea that you can yeah, go ahead.
I have an optimist point. How's that?
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Which is that I think about why a company like the Free Press has been successful. And I think part of it is that the like one of the tenets of the Free Press is based on debate. And we have these open debates where people come to concerts in person to watch people debate these really big existential topics. Like what you're talking about with AI, we hosted a debate about this and you can find it online. And we brought, not me because I'm not part of this team, but like our amazing events team and like programmers brought in these really fascinating scholars from both sides of this debate to kind of duke it out on stage in front of people. And the idea is like, then you go home and you talk about it with your mom and you talk about it with your husband and you're like, I think this, and then you disagree. And like, that is so satisfying. It's also so innately human.
Yeah. I agree.
And I do believe that at the end of the day, like our desire to want to better understand the world, want to debate each other, connect with each other through that conversation. I do hope that prevails because I think that's an innately human quality. And like, is part of why companies like the Free Press have been successful is they've tapped into that.
I hope that prevails as well. And I actually, to what you're saying, one of the things that's been frustrating is that within the right wing media sphere, there's obviously the fracture between Ben Shapiro, sort of representing one side of conservatism, and then Tucker Carlson, like they don't like each other. And everybody's been like, well, a while ago, they were like, let's just do a debate. Let's just have you two debate and just like go after each other. And neither of them would do that. That was really frustrating to me. Not like I get like you can come up with a million excuses to not debate somebody. You can say that they're paid off by Qatar. You could say they're paid off by the Jews, whatever you want. I mean, in all these cases, everybody's got something to say. And I think all that's stupid. You should just get people face to face and let them go after each other. They don't have to like each other. I'm sure Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro are never going to like each other, but that would be really helpful. I just think for all of Americans to see their ideas pitted against each other. And they won't do it. And I think that's like the Free Press is trying to do stuff like that. I think that's wonderful. And there are other people trying to do things like that. But definitely, a lot of people are just becoming isolated in their little tunnel and they don't want anybody to interfere with that. And that's kind of what makes me nervous. So I hope that the institutions like the free press prevail, because it would be great if we could have people have face-to-face talks and debate, which is like what the right was talking about 10 years ago when the left wouldn't debate anybody. They're all like, you need to debate. And they're like, we're not going to do it. We don't think that you're coming from a good perspective or whatever. They like assume your motives. And now that's what we're doing to each other. It's crazy. I don't know. That just drives me crazy anyways.
No, I think that's a really interesting point. And, I agree with you. The more face-to-face conversations we have, the better. Even in this conversation with you, Andy, it's been so interesting and so fun because we've had some slightly different worldviews and perspectives, and I've really enjoyed hearing your perspective on the world and thinking about that and grappling with that. And it's fun. I enjoy doing that.
You would describe that as joy. I'm just kidding. I'm very down about it.
Maybe what you were saying wasn't so joyful.
Yeah.
But the idea and the concept of grappling with a perspective that I might not otherwise hear on the day to day, and having to think about that and think about how I feel about that's a great thing to do. It's a great exercise to do as a person. Right. It makes us all smarter and more thoughtful and more empathetic.
I think I agree with that. Yeah, no, I think you're right. Maybe I'm just around the wrong people or something like that. But young Gen Z people, I think, have lost the desire to engage in the conversation. I think millennials lost it too for a long time. Like that's why you're having people like Mamdani. That's almost like a resentful vote, like Mamdani and some of these people in Wisconsin. We have a lady who's running to be the governor, who's like a socialist, like 32-year-old lady. I can't remember her name, but she's like a hardcore, like outspokenly socialist, and she's doing well. She's gaining popularity. And then you also have on the right, like people like Fishback, who are sort of like middle fingers to the establishment MAGA movement. And some of the things that he says, I agree with. And some of the things he says, I'm like, what are you talking about? You're also 35 and you're telling everybody to get married and have kids, and you're not married and you don't have kids. So that just seems a little weird to me. So like stuff like that is happening where it seems like Gen Z, instead of trying to continue to engage in the dialogue, are opting out for Marxist power struggles, basically. And the question is, which side is going, is it going to be the socialist commies, or is it going to be like the nationalist? Like, I don't know which side is going to win out, but that's sort of the question right now. And I don't know how that conversation shifts, because like you said, depending on what platform you're on, the age ranges shift for the free press as to like who watches and who listens. Like I would assume that older folks are the ones reading the pieces more so than the younger folks, which is the most horrifying thing ever, because I think the new statistic is like most Americans haven't read a book in like 5 years, and that's not good.
I did see that statistic as well, and actually took it as a personal challenge to read more books, because I was thinking to myself, gosh, when was the last time I read a full book? And I need to get back on that. So I'm actually I'm on the audiobook grind at the moment, and really trying to get into some good books.
Yeah. East of Eden. Listen to East of Eden. I'm just Steinbeck. That's my like.
Can't go wrong.
You can't go wrong. Steinbeck's amazing. And East of Eden is sort of like well, it's good. Just listen to it. Anyways, yeah. So we'll wrap it up here. I think that's all interesting, and obviously we want for Chinese persecution to stop. And I think that the best thing for Christians to do is to just pray for people who are being persecuted, and to speak about it, to talk about it, and to report about it, and things like that. But from the Christian perspective, you pray for these people. You pray that they would stay faithful in persecution. And that's the goal of Christianity. And you read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says people will be blessed when they're persecuted for him. And that's what's happening in China. So these pastors in China and all over the world who are being persecuted, and not just pastors, just regular Christians, are some of the best that we have to offer in Christendom. And so we should be sorrowful and joyful for them, because they're suffering with Christ, and suffering is bad. So all that to say, thanks for reporting on this. Seriously, this is great. And thanks for having this conversation.
Thank you. And I appreciate you picking up this story as well, because as you said, kind of keeping their names, sharing their stories, I think is the best we can do right now to really show people what these people are going through and what they're fighting for.
Yeah, 100%. Well, thank you.
Thank you.